Hello and welcome to my 500th subscriber special. In order to celebrate such a momentous occasion for this community, and given that my specialty is ancient history, today I'll be guiding you around the world as it was all the way back in 500 BC. I'll be covering as many of the cultures and states around then as I can, but because of time constraints, I wasn't able to get to every corner of the globe, unfortunately, so I'm sorry in advance if I don't cover your region. And this is going to be a pretty long video, so feel free to skip around. In addition, because it's essentially the length of a documentary, I just didn't have the time to supply it with as many images as I would with a normal video, so treat it like a podcast episode supplemented with images. Now let's get started with our tour. As we just talked about in my last video on Egypt in the year 500 BC, the year 500 BC was encompassed by the reign of Darius I in the Persian Empire. He was its third king of kings from 522 to 486 BC, and in 500 BC he would have been around 50 years old and in his 22nd regnal year. He reigned over the Persian Empire during its territorial apogee, when it extended from Macedonia to the Indus Valley, although Darius himself conducted military campaigns as far as the Volga River in Russia. I reckon he saw more of the world than almost anyone else at the time, except us. As I mentioned earlier, Darius had gained the throne by deposing the brother of Cambyses II, Bardia, who Darius claimed was actually an impostor who couldn't have been Bardia because Cambyses II had secretly had him murdered back when he was in Egypt. But Darius didn't depose him alone. He was aided by 6 other noblemen. After they had succeeded, some of them initially suggested turning the Persian Empire into a democratic republic, or an oligarchy. But Darius convinced them to stick with monarchy. They decided who would become king by seeing which of their horses would be the first to neigh at the rising sun one morning, and Darius cunningly got his mare to neigh first by getting his groom to rub his hands over a stallion's balls and then placing it near the mare's nostrils during the test. Darius reportedly openly flaunted that he had done this and even supposedly erected a statue of himself mounted on his horse commemorating his and his groom's efforts. After squashing a few revolts, Darius began expanding the empire. In 515 BC, he conquered the Indus Valley and even reached Afghanistan. Soon afterwards, he conducted a campaign against the Scythians, fearsome nomadic horse riders from the far north. To do this, he crossed the Bosporus, went into the Balkans, crossed the Danube, and pursued the Scythians all the way to the Volga River. During this time, he made the Kingdom of Macedonia his vassal and conquered many cities of the northern Aegean, and as a result, the Greeks, very reasonably, became increasingly concerned over his power. Just as a side note, the king of Macedonia at that point was a guy called Amyntas I, who was its independent king until 511 or 512, and he remained a vassal of the Persians until his passing in 498 BC. Just 6 years later, in 492, Macedonia was fully conquered by the Persians. But Darius didn't just spend all his time conquering, he also divided his empire into provinces governed by satraps, built an extensive system of royal roads, began the huge construction projects in Persia that we mentioned earlier, and drastically reformed the empire's currency. I think this is worth talking about, and it's not just because I'm a coin nerd or anything. So between 510 and 500 BC, Darius reformed the empire's coinage by moving away from simply mimicking those coins minted by King Croesus of Lydia, which had formerly been a kingdom in Asia Minor that had been annexed by Cyrus the Great. 2 new denominations were created by Darius, the golden daric and the silver siglos. 1 daric was the equivalent of 20 sigloi. Darics were between 8.1 and 8.5 grams and were of nearly pure gold. Gold that had a purity of between 95 and 99%. A siglos was 5.5 to 5.6 grams and was at first 97 to 98% pure silver, although the silver quantity diminished later on. I know it seems as if the term daric is derived from Darius' name, but the term actually derives from an old Persian word for golden, deruyaka. A particular type of these coins, Type 2 darics and Type 2 sigloi, were introduced right around the year 500 BC, between 505 and 480 BC, and they both bear depictions of the king shooting arrows. These are actually some of the earliest representations of a country's ruler on their coinage. Now we know for certain that they had to have been produced right around the year 500 BC because a clay tablet that's dated to the 22nd regnal year of Darius' reign, i.e. 500 BC, bears the impression of two of these Type II sigloi. These were not minted in Persia, but instead at Sardis in Lydia, which had become the capital of all the empire's western satrapies. Bartering remained an important form of commerce in Persia itself for a long time, and the daric mainly circulated only in the western portions of the Persian Empire. Sigloi are hardly ever found outside of Asia Minor, but gold darics wound up spreading across the ancient world and became an international currency. The palace Darius built in the northern part of the city of Susa and the palace of Takara, Persepolis, were probably being built at the time. The palace at Persepolis included its grand apodama, or large hypostyle hall, but was only finished during the reign of Darius' son and successor, Xerxes I. These palaces were infused with artistic influence from all corners of the Persian Empire, not just Egypt. Additionally, Darius was also in the process of completing the unfinished works of Cyrus the Great in Pasargadae. During Darius' reign, the official capital of the empire proper became Persepolis. The earliest remains there date to 515 BC. But in reality, the empire was actually ruled from Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana, because Persepolis' remote and mountainous location made it an inconvenient royal residence. Darius would go on to lead the first Persian invasion of Greece during the First Persian War less than a decade after 500 BC. And Darius' eventual heir, Xerxes, who was 18 years old in 500 BC, would go on to do the same. So in order to more fully understand how this came to be and how it threatened the existence of the world's first democracy in its earliest years, let's travel to Greece. I'll be mainly focusing on the two Greek city-states everyone knows and loves, Athens and Sparta. Let's start with the Spartan king, and you'll see why. Sparta's king in 500 BC was a man by the name of Cleomenes I, who was the half-brother of the future Spartan king Leonidas. Yes, the Leonidas from 300. He attempted to extend Sparta's influence and in so doing intervened in Athenian politics rather frequently, so his life is key to understanding what was happening in Greece as a whole at the time and how Greek democracy was born. In 510 BC, Cleomenes expelled the tyrant Hippias from Athens at the request of the exiled but powerful Athenian Alcmaeonidae family. I'm sorry, some of these words are pretty hard to pronounce. This family was led by another important power player at the time, a man by the name of Cleisthenes. The Alcmaeonidae convinced the Spartans to come to their aid by bribing the oracle of Delphi to tell the Spartans to help them. Meanwhile, Hippias fled to the court of the Persian satrap Artaphernes in Sardis and told him he'd give the Persians Athens if only they'd restore him, which is important to keep in mind. Cleisthenes and another aristocrat, Isagoras, fought one another over control of Athens once Hippias was gone. During this time, in 508, Cleisthenes proposed to the people that he'd establish a democracy. Now, it isn't clear why he did this, especially since he was a powerful aristocrat, but it was probably to prevent the city from becoming a Spartan puppet. The practice of ostracism also came about in 508 BC, and it was a practice involving citizens deemed a threat to the Athenians' new democracy being exiled for 10 years if 6,000 other Athenian citizens voted on it. If 6,000 other Athenian citizens voted in favor of it. Isagoras expelled the Alcmaeonidae family yet again because of their proposed democracy, and additionally because they were supposedly cursed. He also expelled hundreds of other Athenians because he also claimed they were cursed too. And Cleomenes, who was having an affair with Isagoras' wife at the time, according to Herodotus, came to his aid. The Athenians revolted against Isagoras after he attempted to abolish the Boule, a council of Athenian citizens appointed to run the daily affairs of the city, and trapped him and Cleomenes on the Acropolis for 2 days before they were allowed to flee, but 300 of Isagoras' followers were killed. Cleisthenes came back to the city in 507 and quickly established the world's first democratic government. Cleomenes was understandably a bit embarrassed by what happened on the Acropolis, so he gathered an army the next year with the aim of making Isagoras tyrant of Athens again. This army then invaded Attica, but his campaign wound up failing. The Athenians were still greatly concerned by this, however, and actually requested aid from the Persians by sending some ambassadors to the satrap Artaphernes in Sardis. But Artaphernes requested that the Athenians give him earth and water, a traditional token of submission, a request which the Athenian ambassadors gave into. They lost a lot of face for this when they returned to Athens. Later, Cleomenes again tried intervening in Athenian politics by attempting to convince Sparta's allies to help him restore Hippias as tyrant of Athens. This failed. Right around 500, after going to Sparta, Hippias went back to Artaphernes and started telling him damaging lies about the Athenians. The Athenians then sent a messenger to Artaphernes forbidding the Persians from listening to their exiles. But Artaphernes instead sent an ultimatum back to Athens: take back Hippias or face ruin. The Athenians balked at this, which was a snub to the Persians that essentially amounted to a declaration of war. Through this, they became the enemy of the Persian Empire, which basically sets the stage for the whole First and Second Greco-Persian Wars. Next, let's see what was going on in Ionia, the Greek cities on the west coast of Asia Minor that were then part of the Persian Empire. Because the things going on there in 500 BC were also important in setting up those hugely significant wars. At the time, the Persians sponsored tyrants in the cities of Ionia because the elites there were always divided into feuding factions, and as such they couldn't help the Persians rule their new subjects there. One of these tyrants was a guy by the name of Aristagoras. He was the tyrant of the city of Miletus. In 500 BC, Aristagoras was approached by some exiles from the island of Naxos in the Aegean, who asked him to annex their island. This was too good of an opportunity to pass up for Aristagoras because he could use this annexation of Naxos into the Persian Empire to strengthen his position in Miletus. Aristagoras approached the aforementioned satrap Artaphernes with this proposal. Artaphernes agreed, and then went to his higher-up for further approval. His higher-up was none other than Darius I. Darius assented to this expedition, and 200 triremes were assembled in order to attack Naxos the next year. In 499 BC, Aristagoras launched his expedition to conquer Naxos. The mission was a debacle, and sensing his imminent removal as tyrant of Miletus, Aristagoras chose to plunge all of Ionia into a revolt against Darius I. This is referred to as the Ionian Revolt, and it would last until 493 BC. It was the first significant conflict between the Greeks and the Persian Empire, and as such, represents the first stage of the Greco-Persian Wars. Athens was already in a position to support the Ionian cities when they began their revolt because of the reasons I just mentioned. Although Ionia was eventually subjugated by 493, Darius vowed to punish Athens for their support of the revolt, and he also realized the threat posed by the Greek city-states, and that's why Darius decided to conquer the whole of Greece and began the First Greco-Persian War in 492. That wasn't all that was going on around Egypt at the time. In fact, an often forgotten kingdom lay just to its south in Nubia at the time. It was heavily influenced by Egyptian culture to the point where it was basically the bootleg version of Egypt, but it did add its own twist to it, to be fair. And its name was the Kingdom of Kush. So here's how it became a thing. After the end of Egypt's new kingdom, Egypt lost Nubia, which had been Egyptian territory for centuries. By 760 BC, all of Nubia had been united by one King Kashta, who ruled the newly minted Kingdom of Kush from the city of Napata. The royals of the creatively named Napatan dynasty he was a part of were buried in steep-sided rip-offs of Egyptian pyramids and necropoli near Napata. They even ruled Egypt between 743 and 664 BC as the 25th dynasty, but they eventually got ousted from Egypt by the Assyrians, who themselves got ousted by the native Egyptians. The man ruling Kush in 500 BC was named Amanias Tabarka, who likely ruled it between 510 and 487 BC. Nothing is really known about the events of his reign, but his pyramid number 2 at the royal necropolis of Nuri near Napata, was excavated by Harvard University and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 1917, and miraculously, the tomb was intact enough that it still contained some golden grave goods, including at least one, and almost certainly 2, golden pectorals. One of these things is in the Antiquities Museum of Khartoum, and the other was published in 1951 in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies after it was brought to a scholar's attention by a Cairo antiquities dealer who had it in his possession. The Phoenicians established Carthage around 3 centuries earlier than 500 BC in 814 BC, but they continued to pay tribute to the natives surrounding them until the 5th century. In 500 BC, Carthage was one of the richest and most powerful cities in the Mediterranean, as it carried metals, oils, wine, and grain around the western Mediterranean and manufactured luxury goods like perfume, glassware, ivory carvings, fine woodwork, and expensive purple dye. Carthage had also recently become the leading Phoenician political power, given that Phoenician cities in the Levant, like Sidon and Tyre, which Carthage had originally been a colony of, came under the control of the Babylonians and then the Persians. Scores of Levantine refugees may have flooded into Carthage as a result of this. The king of Carthage at the time was a guy by the name of Hamilcar I, the third king of the Maganid dynasty, who ruled from 510 to 480 BC. After his reign, the power of the Carthaginian monarch would greatly diminish. Carthage also became rather expansionist at this point in time because the Phoenician trade monopoly was being threatened by the Greeks. It established trading posts in Sicily, Sardinia, and even the south of France, and right around 500 it was first expanding into southern Spain. By the end of the 6th century BC, Carthage had also assumed control over most of the other Phoenician colonies in the region it was in, and had subjugated some North African tribes. As a result, it ruled parts of the North African coast from modern Morocco all the way to modern Libya. But Carthage was more focused on maintaining maritime trade over expanding its borders, and so it primarily built settlements and exerted influence over coastal areas and focused on building up its navy. You could say that its ambitions were more commercial than imperial. But the presence of both Greeks and Phoenicians in these lands created a lot of pressure, which eventually culminated in war, especially in Sicily. The Carthaginians ruled the Sicilian cities of Motia, Panormus, and Soluntum by 500 BC, and for decades prior to this, Carthage had been fighting with the Greeks in the region, ousting them from Corsica and allying with the Etruscans in doing so. I wish I could cover the Etruscans in this video, but we simply don't have time. They also took over Sardinia, and had of course conquered parts of Sicily. Carthage had to respond to at least 2 Greek incursions in Sicily, in 580 BC and in 510 BC, the latter involving Darius the Spartan, brother of Cleomenes I and Leonidas. By the end of the 6th century BC, Carthage had conquered most of the old Phoenician colonies in the western Mediterranean. But Rome and Carthage weren't at each other's throats just yet. In fact, just 9 years earlier, in 509, Carthage and Rome signed the first of multiple treaties outlining their respective spheres of influence. So I've invited my good friend to explain what was going on in Rome in 500 BC. Enjoy.
Steve bought me from a Greek slave merchant for this segment. Anyways, according to Roman legend, by 510 BC, the Romans were on the verge of revolt against their tyrannical king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. Now, Tarquin, of course, being famous for being such a despotic king that it caused the Romans to supposedly swear an oath to oppose monarchy forever. And we all know they definitely kept that promise. But anyways, in 510 BC, Tarquin was at war with the Rutuli people just to the south of Rome. And while he was gone, his son, Sextus Tarquinius, had raped a noblewoman named Lucretia, who was the wife of Tarquin's cousin, Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. In her grief, Lucretia committed suicide, which this then triggered Collatinus and his buddy Lucius Junius Brutus, the nephew of Tarquin. This Brutus is also supposedly the very ancient relative of everyone's favorite, other Brutus. The two men quickly got rallied in Rome. The Senate and the people, and really anyone who was just pissed off at the king, declared Tarquin an enemy of the state, and declared the Republic in 509 BC, with Brutus and Collatinus being the first consuls. Tarquin, of course, after hearing about the revolt in Rome, tried to return, but was quickly forced to go into exile along with some of his family. Oh no, but don't worry, his story is not even close to done just yet. Tarquin then sent ambassadors to the city to try and organize a plot within the Senate to overthrow the new republic. A few senators, and even Brutus's own 2 sons, were actually part of the conspiracy, but it was quickly found out and all were put to death, including Brutus's 2 sons. Also, during this year in 509 BC, Collatinus was forced to resign as consul due to people's immense paranoia about his connection to the Tarquin family, even though Collatinus was nothing but loyal to the Republic and had just as much reason as anyone else to hate Tarquin. He was replaced by Publius Valerius Publicola as consul. Meanwhile, during this time, our lovely despotic boy, Tarquin, secured the support of 2 Etruscan city-states to the north, Tarquini and Veii. With that, he hoped to try and reclaim his throne. So them and the Romans fought in the Battle of Silva Arcia, and during the battle, one of Tarquin's sons was killed, and even Brutus himself. Afterwards, of course, Brutus was given a big hero-style funeral, and replaced by Spurius Lucretius as consul. Lucretius was, of course, the father of Lucretia. But Lucretius would die almost immediately of old age, and was replaced by Marcus Horatius Pulvius as consul as well. Publico would also enact 2 important pieces of legislation during this year. One was the right to appeal a capital punishment to a people's assembly, and the other was that any man that tried to make himself king would have all his rights stricken away, and you were allowed to legally kill him without reprisal. This concludes most of the major events of 509 BC. Tarquin would again try to reclaim his throne multiple more times. Another time was in 508 BC, when he got the support of Lars Porsena in the Etruscan city-state of Clusium. After that failed, he finally found himself in the Latin city of Tusculum in 498 BC, where his son-in-law, Octavius Mamilius, was leader. And during the subsequent Battle of Lake Regillus, Tarquin's final son would die, and after losing, this would mark the final time Tarquin tried to reclaim the throne. He would finally die in 495 BC. By 494, the patricians and plebeians were at each other's throat over the issue of debt, the debt that many plebeians had incurred over the past few years. And many of these people, including soldiers, could not pay this debt and were subject to harsh punishments such as becoming a servant to their debtor. As a result, when the Romans were at another minor war with some Sabine and Volscian tribes, and when men were called to fight them, they refused. So eventually, the Senate appointed Manius Valerius Maximus as dictator to deal with the crisis. He promised the people that once the war was finished, they would resolve the debt issue immediately. So of course, the people listened, as Manius was the brother of the beloved Publius Valerius Publicola. Now, once this minor war was finished, Manius did go to the Senate and tried to get them to enact some kind of debt relief, but the Senate refused. Enraged by this, the plebeians decided to just leave the city and abandon it and leave it to the patrician classes to fend for themselves. With the city now virtually defenseless, and even more tribes starting to act up near Rome, the patricians had no choice but to listen to the demands of the masses. They sent their envoys, and as a result, the position of tribune of the plebs was formed, which in theory was meant to shield the masses from possible tyranny of the patrician class. And eventually, things went back to normal, and men were now willing to fight. This whole event became known as the First Secession of the Plebs. One of many different confrontations between the plebeian and patrician classes that would occur throughout Roman history. This about wraps up the time I have for now, but it's important to note that much of what I said previously likely did not happen exactly the way that I stated it, as this early Roman history is a series of myths and legends that the Romans mostly told themselves. Even the date for the founding of the Republic in 509 BC is suspicious, as it seems like it might have been a later fabrication to one-up Cleisthenes in Athens by a whole year. But regardless of how exactly it happened, it's still always fun to talk about and explore. Thanks to the Pharaoh Nerd for having me on, and until next time.
Moving to the eastern edge of the Persian Empire once again, we get to ancient India,